I think we can begin.
That sounds
Let's
great.
see if it's, yes.
Good. Okay, let us go ahead and get started. So, welcome to The Conduct of Life, a course jointly taught through Harvard College as Ethical Reasoning 20, through the Law School as HL23 something, and through the Divinity School as Div School HL23 again something else. And welcome all of you. The way we will be doing the course is as follows. As you've probably already gathered, our main meeting space will be here from 1 to 3 every Wednesday. We will all be meeting together, and we will be running this as a large-scale discussion group. Roberto Unger and myself will give opening statements, and then we will open it up for discussion. Those entering through the college, through Ethical Reasoning 20, will also have a discussion section separately from this. And the rest of you will just be here with us exclusively, and the discussion sections will be closed only to those in the college. Now, in terms of the course itself, the goal of this
And we
is
should
to
introduce maybe.
Oh, and yes, and for the undergraduates, our amazing TF is Sasha, who is an extraordinary figure. So you will love getting to know him. Those of you who are not in the college, who therefore won't be in the discussion sections, you will also get to know him because, as is true of everyone, Sasha will be very actively involved in our discussions. So Sasha, thank you. You've taught it for many years, and we welcome you back. So let me say a few words about what this class is about. Yes, it is about the conduct of life, and we mean this in the strongest possible sense. We will be interrogating some of the most fundamental questions about how we should think about ourselves, how we should be living our lives, what kinds of worlds we should be building. And when I say we will be interrogating these at the most fundamental level, we will organize the course as such. First of all, we will organize the course globally. So we will pull from great attempts to wrestle with these questions from wherever in the world they happen to arise. We will mainly be looking at materials from the Western world, from South Asia, and from China. However, the discussions may, and very often will, encompass other parts of the world as well. Our goal here will simply be, if it is an extraordinary set of questions being posed anywhere, let's bring them to the table and let's wrestle with them. That will be the goal of the course. Accordingly, what we'll be doing in this Wednesday session will be asking these questions. Think of the readings, which will hopefully, if we've been successful, be extremely provocative. Think of them as provocations. We will not be spending our time here together going through line 6 of page 37 of this text of Schopenhauer. Rather, we will say, what is Schopenhauer trying to do? What questions does it bring to us? And how therefore would we rethink everything accordingly? And we will take these seriously as provocations. We will hopefully take them seriously such that they will allow us to challenge our most fundamental assumptions. We will take them seriously in the sense as well of allowing us to hopefully repose the questions we walked into the classroom thinking we understood, and then together, in these 2 hours, we will wrestle with these questions. Let me underline this as well by giving a contrast. There are other courses in ethical philosophy that one could take at Harvard and elsewhere that will also claim to be dealing with ethical issues, and we'll be looking at some of those attempts very briefly next week, but let me give you a quick introduction to them as a contrast to what we will be doing. So here's a standard question that is often put in classes dealing with ethical issues. Okay, there are 4 of you stuck in the middle of the ocean on a life raft. 3 of you have enough food, and 1 doesn't. Ethically, what do you do? Do you decide to throw someone off? In which case, how do you decide to throw that person, and which person gets thrown off? Or do you divvy up the food and you all potentially starve to death? How do you deal with this question? And then ethical philosophy courses will take you through the possible answers. And we'll discuss them in more detail next week, but there's the utilitarian response, this other response, and you'll think through the questions. Or another way the question is often posed is in something called the trolley experiment. So you're on a bridge and there's a train coming down, and if the train continues, it will kill 3 people, but if you pull the switch, the train will move to another track and it'll only kill 1. So ethically, do you pull the switch or not? And then you go through. Would a utilitarian say you pull the switch or not? Blah, blah, blah. What occurs, of course, when you do these thought exercises is it seems like you're doing something significant because you then think through all the permutations of how to make that decision. In fact, what you're doing is not doing anything at all, because the whole way these thought experiments work is they prevent you from asking the fundamental questions. They take for granted that you are you, that you shouldn't or not put in a position that you should be forced to rethink any of your assumptions about yourself, the world in which you're living, the type of a life you are leading, and it's simply a question in the abstract: do I do this or do I do that? Fine and good, and you can play these games until the end of time, and it will not affect anything about the way you actually live your life and what type of a human being you become. Our goal in this class will be the precise opposite. We, on the contrary, will try to pose questions that could not, if we take the question seriously, allow us to not rethink our assumptions. We will pose questions fundamentally about what are our assumptions about the world, about ourselves, about the lives we're leading, and what are real alternatives out there that have huge implications for what we'll be doing. In other words, questions that will actually affect our lives, since probably we're not ever going to be on a life raft with 4 of us and food for 3. We will pose questions about how we actually are living our lives. And, of course, we will be doing so in a context where you all will be thinking through these questions about how you will be living your lives. And we want to give you not answers from throughout the world, but incredibly provocative questions and ways of framing those issues that I think will force you to rethink absolutely everything. Accordingly, as I mentioned before, these 2-hour sessions will consist of us together wrestling with these questions. We will ask you to read the texts in advance. They will, again, be provocative, and we want you to think of them as provocative. Well, you couldn't not think of them as provocative, but I mean, think of them that way in the sense that we want you to take them seriously and wrestle with them. And we will spend these 2 hours doing so together. The way we will physically do this is Roberto Mangabeira Unger or I will alternate. We'll give an opening statement. The other will often give a response, and then we will open this up. When I say open this up, don't think you have to ask questions of us, although you're certainly welcome to. On the contrary, we want this to be a large-scale discussion. So feel free to make statements yourself about the topics that hopefully our readings are bringing to bear. Make claims, argue amongst each other, and we will be here basically to guide that discussion, not to be the people you will ask or seek answers from, but people who are equally trying to wrestle with them. Also, and for much the same reason, we will not be doing the sorts of exams or papers that you might otherwise expect. You certainly will not be having an exam about what would you do on that life raft. On the contrary, the questions we will pose will be, in terms of the undergraduate students, small papers, but provocative papers, where we will ask you to think through fundamental questions. And then for all of you, a final assignment that will be extremely open-ended, giving you the freedom to write about and in whatever means you find exciting to think through these issues. In short, both our organization of the class time and our assignments will be aimed toward these big questions. This will probably not be like too many other courses you have or are likely to take at Harvard, whether that be at the college level, the law school, or the divinity school. We do, however, hope it will, for much the same reason perhaps, be a highly, highly, highly provocative one. Now let me also mention one other detail. We also will be filming our discussions. The camera, as you can see, is aimed only at Roberto and myself, so you all will not be filmed. But we do this nonetheless, so if you would like to go back and review the 2-hour discussion, you are more than welcome to. So these will be filmed, they will be online, usually takes about 2 or 3 days, but after every session, 2 to 3 days later, they will be on the website, open access. You're more than welcome to look at them. This also, of course, means if you're feeling sick and can't come to class, you can watch them. We do, however, strongly, for reasons that I'm sure are obvious by now, encourage you to physically be here, because the point of this course is really our discussion together. And you're not going to be seeing on the website lectures by the two of us. You'll be hearing a hopefully exciting discussion, but needless to say, it's much more exciting if you're here partaking of it. So there will be videos available. Think of them as helpful for review and rethinking fundamental issues, but please come and please be actively involved in our discussions. And that really is going to be the heart of the class. So with that is a very quick introduction to our goals and some of the basic logistics of the course. Are there any questions at this stage before we turn to a lot of the big issues themselves? But any questions about overall orientations or specific logistics of any kind? Please, yes.
When are we going to get the information for the sections in the undergraduate level?
Probably next week. I look to Sasha. Yeah, so hopefully next week. So enrollments, I think, will come in by the end of this week, if I'm not mistaken. So as soon as that is in, we will send you an email with all the section issues in terms of what you'll be doing, and oh yeah, I should let you speak.
So we'll have our first section next week, and I will be in touch as to time, date, and all other.
So yeah, as soon as you enroll, it pops up on our website, and as soon as that enrollment is done, then we can send you all emails, and we'll set up the discussion sections. Great, thank you. Any other question, logistical or in terms of broad orientation? Okay, well then let me turn things over to Roberto Mangabeira.
Are you sure?
Oh, please, go ahead.
Say
yes.
something about substance
Oh,
first.
no, please, feel free to go ahead. We'll be going back and forth. So
Back
please.
and forth. So I will now suggest a first take on the agenda of this course. This course is about the only question that no one can evade. What shall I do with my life? How will I live? Of course, it's possible for a person not to reflect about this question, but the way in which he lives will, in fact, express an answer to it. And it's in that sense that it's a question that cannot be evaded. One might describe this topic of ours as ethics, but it's not ethics in the sense that is now generally understood in the Anglo-American Academy. The main subject of study in the high philosophical culture, at least in the English-speaking countries, is the contrast of certain methods, the utilitarian method, the Kantian or so-called deontological method, and the social contract method, that pretend to specify our obligations to one another. What do we owe one another? So the fundamental perspective is a legalistic perspective. And the underlying concern is, how can I get to the end of my days having paid all of my debts, my moral debts? It's as if human existence were registered in a kind of book of accounts in which we have debts and credits, and we want to get to the end with all of our debts paid out so that our hands will be clean. So this is an understanding of ethics as a kind of hand washing. But that's not the idea that animates our inquiry here. The idea that there's a legalistic framework about obligations only obliquely and partially answers the question, what shall I do with my life? It imposes certain constraints, but within those constraints, you're still left with the question you started out with. How shall I live? How shall I live after I have paid my tribute to all the others and satisfied all of these obligations? And next week, in the second class, we're going to deal with the character and implications of this predominant philosophical approach to ethics and connect it with what we hope to do here. Now, if we turn away from this philosophical fashion, from this procedure, to the example of the great philosophers of the past, especially in the history of Western philosophy, we find something very different. And now I'm going to characterize this something different in somewhat skeptical and even hostile terms. What we find is a claim to be doing a kind of super science, the development of ideas about the fundamentals of human existence and of reality. The ultimate truth above all of the specialized disciplines. And the super science is produced in the service of a kind of self-help. So it has a practical objective. Now, what is the practical objective? The objective is to provide us orientation and solace, especially with respect to certain ineradicable flaws in the human condition. Our mortality, we're all going to die. Our groundlessness, we seem to be in the midst of a great darkness. We don't know what the point of all of this is. And our insatiability. There's no limit to our desires. And it seems that at every turn, we try to obtain from the limited, which is all we have, the unlimited, from the finite, the infinite. And this is an ordeal which the philosophical super science wants to save us from in some respect. Now, there are several problems with this practice. First, we have reason to be skeptical about the existence of this philosophical super science. It's as if these great philosophers claimed for themselves some exemption from the normal human condition of groundlessness. The second problem is with the goal of self-help. So to a large extent, the orienting motivation seems to be to provide some kind of balsam, some consolation. And consequently, the philosophical super science is always in the risk of degenerating into some kind of feel-good story. It's claiming ultimate truth, but what it is in fact doing is consoling us for these ineradicable flaws in the human condition. And maybe what we really need is not to be consoled, but to be liberated. And we can't be liberated by illusions. Now, there's a further feature of this classical philosophical practice that might disturb us. And that is that each of the philosophers claims to provide a vision of the fundamental truth about the ultimates of reality and of human existence. but each of them provides a different picture. So we have an experience not just of plurality, but of arbitrariness. Now, one of the philosophers that we're going to read here, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Schopenhauer, says in the introduction to his greatest work, "My philosophy is the definitive solution to the enigma of existence." A characteristic statement by one of these philosophers. Later on, however, in the same book, he says, "A man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament." Now, how can these two statements be reconciled? So this is just another way of appreciating this problem of the conflict. If, however, we turn away from this example of the great philosophers of the past to the contest of moral and religious ideas in the history of humanity, we see something else. It's not just a collection of theoretical systems propounded by isolated individuals. There are certain collective agendas or projects. And the contest of these agendas gives a certain shape to our moral history. Now, that is the setting in which we are going to try to place ourselves here. So although we will be reading some of these great philosophers, what really interests us are these fundamental orientations, which transcend the idiosyncratic positions of the individual philosophers and impose on the history of our moral ideas and anxieties a certain shape. And in particular, there are two such projects that exert great influence in the world today that will be the foremost object of our concern. And what I'm next going to do now in these introductory remarks is to say something about each of these projects. So let me call the first project, just for convenience, the project of self-invention and nonconformity. We can use many different labels to describe it, and we will, during the semester, change the vocabulary. So this project has had its philosophers, its ideologists, some of whom we'll read here, like Emerson and Nietzsche. It has had its political theorists, the great liberal thinkers, like Tocqueville or John Stuart Mill or Herzen. And more generally, it has been associated with one of the great revolutionary forces in the world today, which is the worldwide popular romantic culture carried by the TV dramas or popular music, which spreads throughout the world. And all over the world, in a Brazilian slum or an Indian village, conveys the revolutionary message that the ordinary man and woman is not so ordinary after all, and that we all in humanity participate in something divine, in something higher, that we are the infinite, somehow entangled or imprisoned in the finite. This is the message of this worldwide popular romanticism with its revolutionary impact. So what is the content of this project that I'm calling nonconformity and self-invention? According to this view, to this agenda, our central task is to make ourselves bigger. Our most important attribute is that there is more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever can be in all the social and cultural worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite with regard to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. We spill over. There is in us an element of surfeit, of excess. And this is what, in the theological vocabulary, we call transcendence. And what we need to do in individual existence and in the organization of society is to arrange things so that this central attribute of our humanity develops and is manifest. We become more human by becoming more godlike. Now, to do that, to ascend to a higher form of life, we need to struggle. It's not given to us freely as a gift. We need to struggle. We need to struggle with society. We need to struggle with the others. We need to struggle with ourselves. And the reward for this struggle, for this ordeal, is that we are able to form a self that honors our deepest desires, our innermost identity. And then we become those greater persons that are not the little puppets, the slaves that we at first seemed to be. Now then, that means that in every particular context, we live for the future, for a future form of the self, for a future form of society. And there is the danger in this situation that in living always for the future, we become estranged from the only thing that each of us ever has, which is life right now. That's all we have, existence right now. And if we're always living for the future, then we're in this pursuit of perpetual estrangement from the only reality, which is existence in the present moment. And therefore, in this project, it is necessary to understand and to convert living for the future as a way of living in the present, as a being who is not completely determined by the established conditions of his existence. Now, that's an initial sketch of the general direction or aspiration of this project. And right away, even from that initial sketch, two problems become manifest, two difficulties. And it would be necessary to revise this project to deal with these difficulties. So the first difficulty is apparent emptiness. We become bigger and freer. And then what? So it's like the situation of King Lear, who says, I will do such things, what they are, yet I know not, but they shall be the terrors of the earth. Well, that's the situation in which this project seems to place each of us. So it answers and it doesn't answer the original question, what shall we do with ourselves? How shall we live? And then there's a second set of difficulties, which is, what about the others? the other people. It seems that to be free and to come fully into the possession of life, which is what this project promises us, two things are necessary. One is that we engage in a particular world without surrendering to it. If we can't engage, if we're isolated, we're not free. But if we engage and simply surrender to that world, we're also not free. So we have to find, both politically and personally, a way of engaging in it without surrendering to it. And what we all need is somehow, always, with respect to our context, to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And it seems that that part of our self-possession and of our freedom is indeed recognized by this project. But that's not the whole story. There's another part. The other part is that to be free and to come into the possession of life, we also need to connect with other people. No one is free alone. So Jean-Paul Sartre said, the others are hell, but the others are also our salvation. They're hell and our salvation at the same time. And somehow what we, what we need is to connect without paying for the connection the price of subjugation. We need to find a way of connecting that doesn't subjugate us, both personally and politically, to reconcile these apparently contradictory conditions of our self-possession. And it's that part of the situation that this project, in its initial form, seems not fully to do justice to. The obligations of solidarity, the imperative of reconciliation with the others, are pictured as if there was something that came afterwards. So we become great, we become free, and then because we're strong, we're magnanimous, and we can be generous. But it seems that the problem of connection arises at a previous stage, that there can't be self-construction without connection, without the solution of this problem. And we can even generalize and say, can there be strong individuals without strong collective projects, strong identities, strong nations, distinct national identities and experiments in the world? Humanity develops its powers and possibilities only by developing them in different directions. And those different directions are manifest in the different institutional forms and cultures of the world. How can there be strong individuals against a shadowy background in which there are no strong collective projects? So there we have one agenda, which will be one of the two major subjects of our discussion here. And now comes a second agenda. And let me call it, provisionally, the project of responsibility and solidarity. In some ways, its most comprehensive statement in the history of moral ideas in the world has been Confucianism, not simply the original teachings of Confucius, but the whole tradition that resulted from this teaching. And one could also relate it to the modern secular humanism in the West, except that the modern secular humanism is in a more complicated situation because it has had to reckon in the West with the influence of Christianity. So one interpretation of this second agenda could begin in the following way. You would say, the world is dark, impenetrable, and it has no meaning. But in this meaningless world, we human beings create meaning for ourselves. we open up a space, a human clearing, in the midst of this surrounding darkness. So it's a kind of anti-metaphysical metaphysics. And in this human space, through connection with one another, through cooperation, through our interpersonal relations, we lift ourselves up, practically and morally. And this operation of developing the human clearing in the midst of the surrounding darkness has three main aspects. So the first aspect is that we are shaped and rendered capable of productive interaction with our fellow human beings by the conventions, rituals, forms, and habits of society. They are the mold within which we are civilized. The second element is that society comes to be organized as a set of roles. And then we assume responsibilities to one another by virtue of performing these roles. So, parents and children, teachers and students, employers and employees, superiors and underlings, and so forth. Role-based responsibility, which is then further enhanced or purified or justified when it is sustained by the element of merit, meritocracy. Now comes a third element in this civilizing project, this humanizing project that lifts us up. The third element is the development of our imaginative empathy, our ability to understand the otherness of other people. So the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus said, "The soul of another person is a dark continent that can never be visited." And we have this empathy so that we can, in fact, visit it. And it's developed, it's sustained by education, by a series of practices that allow us to enter into the world of the others. So that then the predominant creative force in society is no longer just a set of transactions among isolated individuals. It's what you could call, in the language of the contemporary cognitive psychologists, joint intentionality. It's not a collective entity, and it's not the isolated individual. It's something in between. And to the extent that we develop this power of imaginative empathy, at a certain point, we no longer need the forms and the rituals and the rules. We become capable of moral improvisation. And our experience of morality and interaction loses any element of heteronomy in which the rules are imposed from outside. So you see that in this conception of life, the core is the idea of the primacy and the sanctity of interpersonal relations. It's not the isolated individual. It's not, on the other side, the state or society pictured as a collective entity. It's the dynamic of the interpersonal, which is our salvation, and which, according to this view, is what we most need to develop. Now, there is also a difficulty right at the outset, just as I cited the difficulties of the other projects. One threshold difficulty is to what extent in this endeavor should we take for granted and accept the established organization of society. For example, the organization of the economy, which labor is performed under certain rules. Is there slavery? Is there wage labor? Is wage labor replaced by self-employment and cooperation? In politics, how is power achieved and maintained? So in every society, there's a situation that's established. To what extent do we take that situation for granted and attempt to improve it or spiritualize it or humanize it? And to what extent does this project require us to challenge the established framework and invent another one? Is it, in other words, a revolutionary project or a counter-revolutionary one? Does it attempt to humanize the world, or does it attempt to create a different world? And according to the answer that's given to this question, this second agenda of responsibility, role-based responsibility and solidarity, could take a very different direction. Now, having characterized in these very schematic terms these two agendas, let me make now a few remarks about the relation between them. Why are they now the two most important agendas, justifying that we take them as part of our central subject matter? One conjecture would be the following. They are the two most important agendas because they represent the twin imperatives of the most advanced societies. They have a real basis, a practical basis, a functional basis in the organization of society, of the contemporary societies. The most important requirements of the advanced societies are, on the one hand, the enhancement of individual agency, of the capacity of initiative, innovation, invention, disruption. And on the other hand, the development of the higher forms of cooperation. So just a few words about each of them. So, invention, innovation. Suppose that there are two sets of moves in every society in the world. There are the ordinary moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. And then there are the extraordinary moves by which from time to time, typically under the pressure of crisis, we challenge and change part of the framework. Well, what seems to be necessary in the development of society, of these most advanced societies, is that this activity of challenging the framework, of experimenting with it, of innovating in it piecemeal, or be rendered banal and perpetual. That innovation not be exceptional or even episodic and discontinuous, but that it be constant. I'll give you an example. So the most advanced form of production now is what we call the knowledge economy. It's not just high-tech industry. It's a revolutionary practice of production that is now present in the whole economy of the most richest economies in the world, not just in manufacture, but in intellectually dense services and in precision or scientific agriculture. It is present, however, only as a fringe that excludes the vast majority of workers and businesses. It requires from its participants perpetual innovation. It demands a higher level of discretion and initiative and reciprocal trust than the level that characterized the previous advanced forms of production. And that's a practical base for this first agenda of nonconformity and self-invention. It requires the development of this capacity for independent agency in the world. Society can't consist of a mass of slaves sunk in routines and incapable of taking initiative. On the other hand, these advanced societies also depend on the development of higher forms of cooperation. Now, what do I mean by higher forms of cooperation? So just controversially, let me go through a little open list. The way in which we cooperate with one another shouldn't be predetermined by some entrenched scheme of social division and hierarchy. There shouldn't be some script that says you can do that because you're the member of such and such a group or class, and you can do that. We can do anything if we must. The institutional form of cooperation should be open. For example, the market economy shouldn't be fastened to a unique version of itself. It should be capable of experimenting with its own institutional forms. The individual should be secure in a haven of vital protected interests and capabilities, but society should be thrown open to experiment to the greatest possible plasticity. And we could go further. So we could say, for example, that in the higher forms of cooperation, wage labor, economically dependent wage labor, would cease to be the predominant form of free labor and would give way, as the liberals and socialists of the 19th century supposed it would give way, to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment, and cooperation. And going further, the relation between the worker and the machine would be transformed. No one should work as if he were a machine. The machine is to do what we've learned how to repeat. And it's programmed according to the algorithm or formula that expresses what we have learned how to repeat. And the point of the machine is to allow us to preserve our supreme resource, our time, for what we have not yet learned how to repeat. Now, my suggestion is that these two agendas derive their power, their seduction, their appeal from the fact that they communicate with these two imperatives of the advanced societies, agency and cooperation. And these two imperatives have a complicated, troubled, contested relation to each other. They're not flatly contradictory, but they're in some kind of tension with each other. Because every innovative practice disrupts the established form of cooperation. So this discussion of the two moral agendas is, at the end of the day, also an inquiry about the fate of the contemporary societies in relation to these two imperatives. Now let me make a second remark. The second remark is that it so happens that each of these two agendas that I've described, the agenda of nonconformity and self-invention, and the agenda of responsibility and solidarity, is headquartered, for the moment, in one of the two superpowers of the present world: the senior superpower, the United States, and the junior superpower, China. In the sense that each of them is the main capital of these agendas. But this is a loose and, in some respects, an accidental relation that could easily be reversed. So the American prophets like Emerson and Whitman and Lincoln spoke this language of the agenda of nonconformity and self-invention. But there's a great deal of reason to think that the Americans might be attracted to the opposite agenda. On the one hand, they confront the limits of an individualist materialism, but they're skeptical about the state. And so they may come to think that the solution lies in the development of the third element, which are all the intermediate organizations between the state and the individual, the voluntary association that was one of the great themes of Tocqueville's interpretation of the United States. And that it's this that needs to be played up. A dense texture of reciprocity and community life that would supersede the unacceptable contrast of the individual and the state. And then they would be attracted to the other agenda as the language in which to describe this transformation. On the other hand, Chinese may be in a circumstance in which they confront a whole array of forms of repression, cultural repression, political repression. But at the same time, their aspirations, their material and non-material aspirations are excited. And there are even facts about their ordinary life, like being a single child in a family, have your narcissism pumped up, and then being in a society in which the official doctrine is the opposite. And they could then be immensely attracted to the opposite agenda. So it's reasonable to think that there could be spiritual revolutionary forces in both of these societies that would move in the opposite direction and that would result in a transvaluation, in a reversal of the association of each with one of these agendas. Now, here's my third remark about the relation of these two agendas. A very natural response to the evocation of this contest, which I've just described, is to say, should be a synthesis. Each is describing a part of the truth, of the moral truth, of what's necessary and convenient. We should just reconcile them. But there's some reason to think that this idea of a synthesis is a misdirection, a misunderstanding. On the one hand, the problem is that these are not just abstractions, as if we're just two rhetorics. And if they were just two rhetorics, any capable rhetorician can develop a discourse that combines them. But they're not just two rhetorics. They're not just a set of abstractions. Their power resides in their relation to certain practices, moral practices, and the institutional background of these practices. And the question is whether this background, this context, can be combined or how. That's not a rhetorical operation. But the second reason to doubt that the idea of a synthesis is feasible in practice is that even if we revise each of these two agendas, we subject them to criticism, as I anticipated already in my initial characterization of them. It's not clear that we would close the gap between them. So here are a set of features that suggest why we might not close the gap. So first, they have radically different starting points. The starting point of the first agenda is the individual self. The starting point of the second agenda is not the state or society, but this idea of joint intentionality, The real thing in our moral experience is not us as individuals or society as a single entity. It's this interaction, this interpersonal interaction. Now, second, they make radically different assumptions, philosophical assumptions, about who we are. The first agenda affirms this transcendence. We are infinite. There's a disproportion between us and these collective contexts. The second agenda insists that we are situated. We are context-bound agents. And there isn't this transcendence or separation. And then third, there are a host of practical implications that result from these two agendas that seem to point in very different directions. Let me give you as an example just one of them, because it's a kind of implication that doesn't naturally occur to us, given that it has a psychological character. And it has to do with a division of humanity which is not recognized in contemporary social science, which is the division of humanity into temperaments. That's one of the ways in which we are divided, not just by class and race or religion, but by temperament. It seems that a practical implication of the first agenda is that there is a part of humanity, let's call them the disruptors, that form the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. So it's not just innovation, it's not in some placid form. The message of the first agenda is disrupt, rebel. And that means conflict. And there is some small part of the human race that is inclined to disrupt. Now, this has to do with a host of natural facts, because we may think that these are just philosophical ideas, but we have biases. So, as someone who's sympathetic with the disruptive temperament, let me cite a bias which sort of pulls the rug out from under the grand pretensions of the disruptors. So, you know, the American historians and social scientists are always doing these empirical studies, these correlations between this and that. And an example of a study is who voted for the execution of the king in the French Revolutionary Assembly. So they tried out a large number of correlations by class, by religious orientation, by this, by that. They didn't work. The only correlation that worked was the following. The vast majority of first sons voted against the execution of the king. And the large majority of second and third sons voted to kill the king. So you see that disruption is anchored in certain natural facts about our situation. It doesn't mean that we can't resist them. They're just biases. But it means that we shouldn't sentimentalize or idealize the bias of disruption. The advocate of the second agenda, the agenda of responsibility and solidarity, suspects that under the grand discourse of disruption and invention lies the poison of self-aggrandizement. So all of this is just to suggest that the idea of a synthesis of these two agendas is not naturally plausible. It's not clear that that's the solution to the problem of this contest. Now, before concluding, I just want to say the following. This contest that lies at the center of the discussion that we plan over this semester does not exhaust the options of moral ideas in history. So these two projects could be seen as two instances of a certain conception of happiness or human flourishing, which is the conception that happiness consists in a fullness of activity, in a plenitude, in the development of our powers, even at the cost of contradiction or tension. And it's a conception which has many other forms. For example, the moral philosophy of Aristotle, other than these forms that I described. But there's another conception of happiness, which is that happiness consists essentially in the negation of pain, of suffering. And according to this view, we suffer so long as we allow ourselves to be entangled in the illusory appearances of the world, the illusion of distinction, of differences among people, time itself as an illusion. And then we're caught up in these coils of insatiability, of insatiable desire, and we suffer endlessly. And the only solution is to disentangle ourselves from these illusions in order to overcome suffering. See that in the philosophy of Schopenhauer. The overcoming of the world and of the will, the denial of the will as the cause of our suffering, the transformative will, which lies at the center of the two other projects. So there are real options, real alternatives to this view. But then there are other positions in the history of our moral and religious ideas that may seem to be alternatives, but maybe aren't. So the most salient example would be the position of the Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the immense influence in the world. So it's true that they're different, at least in the sense that they represent these problems as placed within a larger narrative of interactions between God and humanity. But they're not necessarily different in the content. So, for example, it may be that in Christianity, in Christian theology, the deepest problem is the relation between the idea of infinity, our participation in the life of God, despite our embodiment in our mortality, and the idea of love. So the organizing principle of the moral life for Christianity is not altruism, it's love. And the deepest question is, what's the relation between infinity and love? Now, it seems that that question is simply another way of representing the contest posed by those two agendas, internalized within Christianity itself. And if that were true, then the position in these religions would not be an escape from that debate, but another way of understanding it. So I've presented a view, a partial view, a view from my perspective of our agenda here. And I can ask now at the end, what is the intellectual space in which I propose that we move here? So it's a space that crosses the frontier between what we traditionally describe as philosophy and as religion. And this space has certain characteristics. One of the characteristics is that it anchors an existential imperative, an orientation to the conduct of life, in a vision of our situation in the world. The second characteristic is that in doing that, it collapses the distinction between the is and the ought, between our descriptive or explanatory ideas and our normative ideas. You know the claim in modern philosophy that there's no passage from the is to the ought. But it seems that this distinction between is statements and ought statements only holds with respect to ideas about local parts of reality. To the extent that our ideas become comprehensive about us and our situation, the distinction starts to collapse. The third characteristic of this space that crosses the frontier between philosophy and religion is that it elicits what in theology we would call faith. Faith in a double sense. Faith in the sense that we have to respond, we have to act, without ever having adequate grounds for action. Now, in a secular context, this is what we might call the cognitive gap. So, with regard to large agendas like these two that I contrasted, it's not that there aren't reasons to argue about them and to argue why one is better than another or why it should be changed in one way or another. It's that these reasons are always inconclusive. So it's very different from skepticism or nihilism, saying we can argue, we can clarify, but at the end of the day, there remains a disproportion between the force of our arguments and the weight of the existential options. We must commit ourselves in one direction or another, explicitly or implicitly, by the way in which we live. And we can give reasons, but the reasons that we give never seem to be good enough. They're always inconclusive. That's the cognitive gap. And we can say then that each of these projects is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. It tells us, in effect, act as if I were true, and you will make me true. But it's never a completely self-fulfilling project because reality, our experience of life, fights back. So each of these projects makes a promise. It's a promise of happiness. It's a promise of the perfection of society. Will it keep the promise when we act on it? And that's not something that's controlled by the self-fulfilling prophecy. That's one of the reasons why we can continue to argue, why it's not just circularity. And because there is this cognitive gap, we depend on faith in a second sense, in a second, more limited sense. We need to act always with inadequate reasons, with insufficient grounds, and then this action with insufficient grounds renders us more vulnerable to the others. So we have to let down our guard to some extent. And there is a heightened vulnerability, which seems to be an inevitable consequence or price of this decisive action in one direction or another. So I'm saying this is philosophy, but it's not philosophy in many of the usual senses of philosophy. It's not philosophy in the sense of the super science in the service of self-help. And it's not philosophy as what philosophy has become in a large part of the academy, which is a kind of thought police that claims to determine how we can argue in this or that domain. It's philosophy in another sense. It's philosophy as the mind at war, insisting on its prerogative to think and to speak about what matters most, going up to the limit of what is thinkable and of what is sayable. And that, if we could do it, would be philosophy.
Let's open it up for questions and thoughts.
Maybe you could begin us, Michael.
Sure, so I will say then a few words. First, in full agreement that, yes, this is philosophy. This is not philosophy as it is practiced today in the academy. This is philosophy that would hopefully force us to question our most fundamental assumptions and ask the most difficult questions, period. And I will simply use a few moments before we open it up to engage in that by saying, although I largely agree with your characterization of the conflict between these two, let me take one point that I think actually will have significant implications of disagreement in your characterization of the second one. So you accurately argued that in the second one that becomes particularly important in Chinese philosophy, the view is the world around us is fundamentally without meaning. So to give comments that come up frequently in that literature, the world of our experience is one of chaos. If putatively we can imagine what the world was like before we humans began working with it, it would be a world of just things interacting with other things in usually horrific, horrible ways. And when humans came onto the scene, the argument was we usually are pretty horrific to each other. And the argument was, exactly as Professor Unger correctly noted, then it is up to us then to construct worlds where we can flourish. The key being, again, Professor Unger very correctly pointed to this, that there's no way in advance of knowing what that will mean. So we are constructing worlds, hopefully where we can flourish, without having any idea of where that will take us. Full agreement. I think that's a beautiful characterization of it. The one point of disagreement, though, is when you got to the second stage of that argument, you said, and then the view is that we are all going to be civilized by being born into a world of habits and roles that will teach us to conform well with each other. The point of disagreement would be, but note, the concern, you could argue this is really one of the overriding concerns in this philosophy, and we'll get to it in a few weeks, is to say one of our dangers as humans, in fact, they would say one of precisely the most common danger that therefore, if they are correct, and I think they are, we all should be facing up constantly to, is that yes, if the world is, as Professor Unger correctly said from this point of view, a world of endless relationships, our danger as humans is that we will fall into habits that will so define ourselves, define our interactions, that we come to think of them as natural. So we often, to give some of their examples, we will define a personality as simply, oh, I am the sort of person who is X, Y, and Z. And they would say, no, you're the sort of person who has fallen into the habit of being X, Y, and Z. That's not telling of you, it's a bunch of habits you've fallen into. When we describe the world as, oh, humans just are, it may be an empirically accurate statement, but it's empirically accurate in the sense that we have fallen into series of habits in which we act in the following way. The reason I emphasize this is they will say the danger, since we're constructing the world, is that usually we do it passively. Usually we construct a world around us not self-consciously. We do it kind of by falling into patterns and habits that then can last for our lives, indeed, for generations, for centuries. And the big push of the philosophical move is to say you're constantly trying to break us out of the sense that the world we're living in is natural, precisely because the argument is, assume the world we live in is probably hardly a good world, and we are hardly acting as we should be acting, and since there's no clear guide telling us what to do, the focus is it's that break they care about. Now, Professor Unger is absolutely right, and this is a huge debate that we'll be getting down to. They want that break to occur not by the claims of the radical will of the individual that they are extremely suspicious of because they feel the claim of the radical individual is likely to be an individual just repeating a bunch of patterns again and habits again. They want to say, no, 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 the goal of the break is to find ways to actually break the relationships that we have with each other, these habitual ones, to open up other possibilities. And indeed, as Professor Unger said, it's a claim of cooperative, sort of a cooperative breaking of patterns and habits rather than a claim of the radical individual will. But the reason I want to emphasize this is it strikes me both take as a starting point the concern that the world we are currently living in probably needs to be changed dramatically, but you're absolutely right. The ways of doing so are not only radically different, I would agree with you, they're incompatibly radically different, and therefore with implications that we will need to wrestle with, because the implications for how we would live our lives literally on even a daily basis take us in radically different directions from these two different points of view. So just a very quick response.
This is an example of something that may happen from time to time in our discussion. You disagree with me, but I don't disagree with you.
So let's open this up. And again, as always with these opening up, you're welcome to ask us questions, but feel free to make statements as well. Since we haven't done any reading, it may be less of the latter, but in general, we want to emphasize that. And feel free to disagree amongst yourselves, and we will both answer questions, but also, hopefully, beginning now to some extent, but over the course of the semester, we will be engaging in discussions with you. So let us open it up. Yes, please.
So you mentioned that real philosophy, or at least a truer philosophy, has always been the warring of ideas within the mind, and modern academia philosophy serves more as a thought police in contrast to this real philosophy that you outlined. So I guess my main question is, what developments, I guess, in this modern world have kind of contributed to the academia philosophy behaving in such a manner?
Sure, I'll give a pessimistic response. I fear that it's an example of a much larger trend. And hopefully there are lots of exceptions to this, and hopefully our class will be in part one. However, I do think, just going back to what we were saying momentarily before, if it is the case that we need to be wary that we tend to fall into habits and patterns that we accept as natural, I fear that one of the big mechanisms, in fact, I would argue probably one that we would all hope to be the mechanism, in which we all would be forced to break through our habitual ways of thinking and rethink the world around us. We would like to think that occurs in the educational sphere. That is what education is about. That's why you come to schools, is to learn to rethink everything, and certainly philosophy ought to be one of the key places, if not the most significant place, where that would occur. I fear that, sadly, the academy is no longer playing that role to a significant degree. I think the academy has begun to play the role of, unintentionally obviously, but reinforcing our habitual ways of thinking. And sadly, I think the way so-called ethics is debated in philosophy departments is a perfect example of this. It's done in a way that prevents us, in a sense, from asking the big questions by doing these thought questions that again, by removing it from all of the key questions of life, means you accept the world as it currently is, and then simply think through a restricted body of possibilities. Do you take a utilitarian way of thinking, a Kantian way of thinking? Not, but because it's done in this abstracted mold, not in a way that forces a rethinking of everything. Now, this only underlines the key point you're asking. Why? I mean, why has this occurred, both in philosophy and more largely in the academic world? Again, I fear it's because if we are these habitual creatures, it is easy to fall into practices that will simply reinforce existing practices. I fear the educational sphere has begun to do this, and it's guided by academics who have themselves become very, very good at being particularized specialists in a particular area. You can become a specialist in that, you can teach that, and it doesn't force you to rethink anything, and it allows you to continue doing that for years, decades, over the course of a career, and writ large, it allows entire programs of entire universities to continue doing this without actually disrupting anything.
Yes. So let me answer this question also. continuing the perspective that Michael adopted just now. So one way to answer your question is to speak to the history of philosophy and to explain why it so dramatically narrowed its focus. But I want to engage it in a way that I think might be more useful to us here with a focus on education. The orthodoxies of the university culture are based to a large extent on the naturalization of a marriage of method to subject matter in each discipline. So it's as if each subject matter had a unique method appropriate to it. So for example, economics, as it's now studied in the American research universities, is not the study of the economy. Economics is the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. If the economy is studied in some other way, that's not economics, it's sociology or something else. And if that method is applied to a subject that doesn't seem to be economic, it's economic nevertheless. Now, to take another example, so there's the idea that evolutionary biology is studied by a historical method, but fundamental physics is studied by an anti-historical method. Now, how can that be? We discovered that the universe has a history. So cosmology has to be a historical science. But cosmology isn't treated as central. It's treated as a kind of scaled up astronomy. And there's a naturalization of the relation of method to subject matter. When that happens systematically, the space for philosophical thinking is dramatically reduced, because philosophy takes place when the cards are jumbled up. And when we think that there's no natural or necessary way of approaching any particular subject matter, the professoriate is intransigently hostile to such a jumbling up. What happens in the normal course of an academic career is that a young academic assimilates a certain method in his 20s in graduate school, an apparatus of analysis and argument, and spends the rest of his life feeding material through this apparatus. It shouldn't be that way. Methods are a dime a dozen. There should be an agenda, visionary impulse. The method should be burned up. But so it's the suppression of that which then is the fundamental ground for the destruction of philosophy. Now, it has a consequence for education, because the orthodoxies of the university culture are projected backward into the national curriculums in the world, which are a kind of infantilization of the orthodoxies of the university culture. And they induce the young to mistake the dominant ideas for the ways things are. So then the young are emasculated and delivered to the higher stages of education, prepared for a life of intellectual servility. So if we can't disrupt the university, speaking in favor of the religion of disruption, we should try and disrupt basic education, and every subject in basic education should be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. And then we would form philosophers.
Yes, please.
Yes, so at some point, there was an assertion that society cannot, in and of itself, take initiative, that rather it must come from individuals. And I would argue that society as an entity can take a collective decision, whether that's through the apparatus of government or community societies, however you would like to put it, that cannot be done by individuals, creating a sort of unique initiative. For example, a one gives a lot of power to the concept of the disruptive person.
Well, I don't think that either of us intended to deny that there can be the formation of collective will under either of these agendas that we described, pictured in a different way. Not at all. So it's the problem in economic and political theory is how are the intentions of the individuals to be aggregated. Both the market economy and democracy are ways of forming a collective will in a society in which there are many conflicting intentions and interests. So they're solutions to this problem. But what they deny is the reification of a collective interest. That they're the real individuals, the real classes, the real forces of society. How will they interact? And then there's this collective organization, which is pictured in a different way, right? From the standpoint of these two agendas.
Yes, please.
You were saying, Professor Unger, about like how these different organizations, society, and then just law and kind of so, and you were also saying like how do we decipher between like it being revolutionary or counter-revolutionary? So could you like explain that?
Well, it was a comment because I was just trying to construct a parallelism between the discussion of the first agenda and the second. So in the discussion of the first agenda, I said, right at the threshold, there are these problems. I described two of them. It's emptiness and its complicated relation to the claims of connection with others. And in then representing the second agenda, I said, a threshold problem is the question of how much of the contemporary organization of society does it take for granted? That is, to what extent does it imagine that its programmatic ideas start from a tabula rasa and a clean slate and with all possibilities open? And to what extent does it build on the existing and attempt to humanize it or improve it? Now, of course, it could take, and in some sense, it must take the established organization as a point of departure. But how far will it go in the transformation of this point of departure? And depending on the answer to that question, this second agenda can acquire very different meanings. That was the point I was making. So, and I think I think we agree that it has often been represented as conservative in the sense of taking much for granted, but it can be developed in a way that is not conservative. And it matters which of these two ways it develops in, because that then penetrates all of its parts. It's not just as if it were some political afterthought to the interpretation of the agenda. It's central to the interpretation of the agenda.
Yes, please.
Professor Unger, your point about Christianity being just a further representation of the contrast of the existing. I'd like to briefly explore that further. Specifically, that the infinite representation, which has credence more towards the Western thought, is irreconcilable with our mortality. And I would imagine that love, which eventually is compared to, is representing that intentionality of creating a communal being. What if the love, which is my understanding of Christian theology, is a divine love that then corresponds between the finite and infinite, and then necessarily weds those two together, as opposed to a contrast? I'd just be curious to hear.
So what's the focus then of the question? What's the specific point? Because the point, the basic reason why that came into the argument was this. At first, it seems that these religions are orthogonal to this dispute In other words, they're just a totally different option. And I was suggesting reasons to think that they have a more complicated relation to the contest of these two agendas. It's true that they embed these issues in this larger framework of dealings between God and humanity. But in the substance, on this interpretation of Christianity that I gave, they communicate with the concerns of the two agendas. It's as if the contest of the two agendas occurred inside those religions. And that was the example I gave of the idea of infinity and love. I should say a little more to explain. So this will come up later in the course. So the idea is infinity. The individual, made in the image of God, participates in the divine life and shares the divine attribute of transcendence, not the divine attributes of omnipotence and omniscience, but this attribute of always being more than the finite circumstances in which he's placed. That's what makes him godlike. On the other hand, in the idea of the relation among people, on this interpretation of Christianity, the organizing principle of our moral experience is not altruism. The organizing experience is love. Love is different from altruism on many different dimensions. So altruism means the sacrifice of self-interest to the interest of the other. And altruism, although it may involve sacrifice, even the sacrifice of one's life, places one in no intimate jeopardy. Altruism is given from a distance or from on high, a gift, involving no intimate vulnerability. And it's to say, we give this. It's a demonstration of solidarity, of generosity. There's no cognitive problem of gaining access to the consciousness of the other human being. That's not what love is like, as it is in fact or represented in Christianity. Love requires a fundamental equality. And love places the lover in danger, because love may be rebuffed and may fail. The gift in altruism, in a sense, can't fail. The gift can be rejected, but the altruist has performed his act of generosity. It's a fundamentally different idea of what is central to our moral experience. The idea of love is the idea that salvation lies in the others, in reconciliation with them, and in reciprocal recognition and acceptance, which is dangerous and difficult even epistemologically in gaining access to their consciousness. Now, then the question is, what's the relation between infinity and love? So that's what I was claiming is the deepest problem in Christian theology. So then you could say, it is in the experience of love that we don't relate to one another as placeholders in some scheme of social organization, as members of a class or a role, but as the radical originals that we all know ourselves to be or want to be, and as these transcendent agents, the infinite. And insofar as we are infinite, then we can have this experience of love. But the problem is that we are not yet these beings. We exist in these societies in which we are in fact placed in these social schemes. And so we have to make ourselves into them. Now, that's a political project, the transformation of society. But we don't live in historical time. We live in biographical time. And the political project doesn't take place in the timeline of our individual existence. So to the extent that this political project has not been achieved, how do we conduct our lives to make up for the failures of politics in our relations to the others and to ourselves? And when we begin to think in that way, our conundrums, our enigmas, our anxieties flow back into the world of the contest of these two agendas. That's what I was arguing.
Yes, please.
I wanted to ask you a question about a point you made earlier about methods and why we need to deconstruct methods to do philosophy. It seems to me that methods are a necessary part of even philosophy, even the philosophy you described, because they serve as kind of condition for truth, condition of understanding, especially.
Could you speak louder, please?
Yeah. So it seems to me that methods, in general, are necessary even for philosophy, even in the philosophy that you described outside of the typical academic philosophy, been led to be the
Yes.
philosophy, because they're conditions for the possibility of understanding each other in collective projects
Yes.
and coming to truth.
Yes.
And whether it's possible for us to even enter into conversation with each other, productive conversation, if we don't have those methods.
So it wasn't an argument against method, if by method we mean simply a way of doing things in the realm of thought. It was an argument against the reification of methods, or what I call the naturalization of the marriage, the forced marriage between method and subject matter. A very simple idea, which at some level should be uncontroversial, that there's never one method by which to approach a given problem or subject matter. That the relation of method to subject matter is always problematic. And the more innovative our thought, the more it requires a methodological change. So, for example, in science, in natural science, every revolutionary idea or theory has methodological implications and changes our view of scientific practice or method in a particular domain. We can't hold the method constant because the method is related to the substance. We can't say there's one natural and permanent method for dealing with the subject matter. I was simply suggesting in that part of the argument that when we begin to unfreeze this relation between method and subject matter, we open a much larger space for intellectual controversy and invention. It's a space which is, as it were, is at the periphery, at the penumbra of the established organized disciplines. And that is the space of philosophy, on this view of philosophy.
And just to quickly underline that point, I think that's exactly right. Be aware that this is true across the board. It's not just in academic philosophy. Across the board, we've created disciplines that tend to naturalize the world around us, by which we mean assuming that the world that we experience, we being we, the social world being the social world, the natural world being the natural world, just is the way they are. And the methods basically, by implication, teach us to think that way. And this is intensely dangerous. To return to the example of economics. So you'll take economics classes. They will teach you good rational choice economics, and you can work very effectively within the field of economics by learning rational choice economics. Of course, by definition, what is going on there, and therefore it fits the word method exactly as Professor Unger is using the term, what happens there is you're not asking any of the fundamental questions. The fact is, markets are not natural. We have used forms of statecraft to create a certain type of a market with certain individuals defined in a certain way, with legal powers controlled in a certain way, corporations defined in a certain way, all of which should be questioned. And in a field of economics, you'd think the entire field should be based upon teaching people to be as self-conscious about the fact that we've constructed markets in a certain way, and have we done a wise job, or should we rethink them? And rational choice economics takes that off the table. It simply says, the market is the market. In fact, they will literally say, humans just are rational choice agents, the market just is natural, and here's how you understand them. It's the same thing as the lifeboat problem in philosophy. It naturalizes an existing order when the whole point should be to question it.
Now, I do think, taking advantage of this discussion of method, that it is important to signal a methodological difficulty in our project here. So I was saying in my remarks, we want to study these agendas, these collective agendas, and in particular two of them, the two that I described and provisionally labeled. And where will we find these agendas? So the claim is there are certain philosophers who have been, as it were, their ideologists, like Nietzsche and Emerson, with respect to the first agenda. But we're not saying that we're studying the philosophies of Nietzsche and Emerson. So that presents a very special difficulty. Because if we were saying, well, this is a course about the ideas of certain philosophers, then we know what the subject matter is, their writings, and the contested interpretation of their writings. But we're claiming something else, that their writings are examples of something which is not uniquely and canonically embodied in any one place. That's much more difficult. And so that seems to be a special methodological difficulty of the kind of study that we're proposing. Because we're dealing with something which somehow is in between the systems of certain philosophers on the one hand, which we can find clearly expressed in their works, and these elusive forms of consciousness that prevail in certain societies. It is the doctrinal interpretation or systematization of forms of consciousness. And it seems very important to study that. But it's not clear, going back to the discussion of method, what is the method by which we should study it? Yes?
So I was interested in your characterization of previous generations of philosophers, the type of studying as the super science of self-help. And clearly you see some limitations of that view. And I'm interested to know what those limitations are. I know you've already elaborated on this somewhat, but specifically, I guess what is the problem of striving for self-help? Is self-help described with moving from human suffering in the direction of human flourishing? Why is that not enough in itself? What's the extra piece that you think needs to come to that puzzle to make it more true or more significant?
Well, I think there are two problems, but this would only be the beginning of a very long conversation. And really, it's not the point here to conduct a campaign against classical philosophy, which consists of good guys compared to the ones who came afterwards. But the two basic problems are, first, with the conception of the philosophical superscience. You know, some illuminated philosophical visionary says, this is what things are really like, and lays it out. So then there's the idea there are these specialized disciplines, and there's another one on top of them, which gives you the whole picture. Now, I'd like to dispute that idea. I say there isn't this philosophical superscience. And so this idea that there's a science of the foundations of what it all means is a dangerous illusion. That's the beginning of the critique of the idea of the superscience. Then comes the critique of the idea of self-help. The problem there is when the emphasis begins to fall on solace. So we're going to die. We're in the darkness. We don't know what the framework is. And we experience insatiable desire. We always want more. And from the limited, which is all we have, we want the unlimited. And then come the philosophers and say, in effect, the self-help, don't worry about that. It's not like that. You're not really going to die, or it doesn't matter that you're going to die. And you're not as groundless as you think you are. Here's an explanation of the framework. And if you follow my method, you will be liberated from the wheel of insatiable desire. So, again, the beginning of the discussion is you won't. This is a patent medicine which they're providing to you to quiet you down in the name of this philosophical superscience. And it's not worth paying that price to be solaced, that what you need is insight and liberation, and not solace.
So you think if it truly encouraged flourishing inside, it would be satisfactory?
Yeah, well, flourishing, of course, is an equivocal word, because they might say, you can't be too frightened if you're going to flourish. And so we'll prevent you from being too frightened, so you can do the things that will allow you to flourish. But the counter-suggestion, which is especially attractive to the philosophers of the first agenda, is that we are sleepwalking in the world. And we sink into a set of routines and compromises which deny us the supreme good. What is the supreme good? It's life right now. It's to come into the full possession of life. And we need to be frightened to wake up. And then we'll be shaken, and we will be converted to life, depending on many other things. But if we attempt simply to tell ourselves these feel-good stories, we will pay the following price, that we will begin to die. And so paradoxically, our way of dealing with death will be to arrange to die beforehand in little installments. And we don't want that. We want to live in a way that allows us to die only once. And that requires us to reject these feel-good stories. That would be the beginning of that argument. But it's a long argument. I think we're
about there in time-wise.
We're done.
Good.
Very good.
Well, thank you all so much. We very much look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Could I
What I meant was coffee. Ashutosh, Ashutosh, are you taking it? You're taking it? What about Anuradha? Anurag? Hey,
Bye, Shatnik.
see you then.
Are you coming for next?
Yeah, of course. When are you coming? Huh? Is that it? Perfect. See you. Okay, I'll see you nonetheless. Bye. Yeah.
Have you decided?
I failed to wake up for it. But it's filmed. Oh, it is? Oh, okay.
Come on, यार. मर्द को ठंड नहीं लगता. आजा. Was she here?
She was just there.
Oh yeah, she was. Oh yeah. No, I.